The Pacific Ocean is not just a body of water. It is a blue prison covering 63 million square miles. It is deeper than the tallest peaks of the Himalayas, and wider than any dream of rescue. Most of us see it from the safety of a beach, but José Salvador Alvarenga saw it from the floor of a 7-meter fiberglass boat for 438 days. This is not a simple story of a shipwreck. It is a terrifying chronicle of the human spirit being stripped of everything: food, water, companionship, and even the concept of time. Scientists said it was impossible. His critics called him a liar. But today, we find a story that redefines the very limits of what a human being can endure. November 17, 2012. In the small fishing village of Costa Azul, Mexico, José Alvarenga was in a hurry. A massive storm was brewing, but the shark fishing was too good to pass up. He hired a 22-year-old local named Esquiel Cordoba, a young man who had never spent a night on the deep ocean. Cordoba wasn't a professional fisherman. He was just a boy looking for a day's wage. They set off in a small, open boat named the Salvador. It was a simple fiberglass vessel, 7 meters long, with no cabin, no protection from the elements, and only a single outboard motor. 50 miles out, the sky turned a bruised purple. The wind began to scream through the fishing lines. A gale hit them with the force of a freight train, lifting the small boat like a piece of cork. To keep from sinking, they had to make a heartbreaking choice. They threw their entire catch, over 1,000 pounds of shark and tuna, into the black water. Then, the ultimate disaster struck. The engine swallowed salt water. It sputtered, cuffed, and died. Alvarenga pulled the starter cord again, and again, and again, until his fingers bled. Silence. In that moment, they were no longer hunters. They were prey. The current caught them, dragging them away from the coast of Mexico and into the great unknown. For the first few weeks, the thirst was not just a feeling. It was a physical torture that reshaped their very souls. Your body is 60% water. When that water level drops, the saliva in your mouth turns into a thick, sticky paste. Your blood begins to thicken like syrup, making it agonizingly hard for your heart to pump it through your veins. Soon, the brain begins to shrink. This is when the visions start. Alvarenga and Cordoba would stare at the horizon and see phantom cities, lush forests, and fountains of cold, crystalline water. But there was only salt, endless, burning salt. They were forced to do the unthinkable. When the clouds refused to break, they drank their own urine. And then, they turned to the sea turtles. Alvarenga discovered that turtle blood was not just a liquid. It was a source of survival. It was cool, metallic, and salty, but it kept their organs from shutting down. As the weeks turned into months, Alvarenga refused to just sit and wait for death. He turned the boat into a floating laboratory of survival. He realized that the hull of the boat had become its own ecosystem. Barnacles and seaweed began to grow on the bottom, creating a small reef that moved with them. This reef attracted small fish, triggerfish, and even small sharks. He would lie on the edge of the boat for hours, the tropical sun beating down on his back until his skin peeled in thick, white sheets. He kept his arms submerged up to the elbows, a perfectly still. He became a human trap. He would wait for a turtle or a fish to swim by, and with a sudden, violent explosion of energy, he would grab them with his bare hands and flip them onto the fiberglass floor. But catching them was only half the battle. Without fire, they had to eat everything raw. Imagine the sensory nightmare, the smell of rotting bird feathers in the midday heat, the texture of raw, rubbery turtle meat that felt like chewing on an old tire. They ate the livers while they were still warm. They sucked the moisture from the translucent eyes of the fish, and they cracked open the bones of seabirds to get to the marrow inside. Alvarenga even developed a technique to catch birds. He would sit as still as a statue, letting the birds land on the boat's edge, thinking he was just another piece of driftwood. Then, snap, he would break their necks in one swift motion. He began to collect plastic bottles that floated by in the garbage patches of the Pacific. He used them to store rainwater whenever a storm finally hit. These bottles became his most precious possessions. He would line them up and count them, over and over, a ritual to prove that he still had control over something in a world that had taken everything away. The physical pain was just background noise. The real enemy was the silence. Around the 4th month, the sky became a permanent ceiling of metallic heat. Young Ezequiel Sardoba began to lose touch with reality. He wasn't like Alvarenga. He didn't have the hardened shell of decades at sea. Sardoba stopped eating. The smell of raw bird meat made him vomit the little liquid he had in his body. He began to waste away. His ribs became blades under his burned skin. He spent hours describing his mother's food. He spoke of warm tortillas, of beans, of hugs he would never feel again. And then, he would convulse. On a cold morning in January, Sardoba's eyes fixed on nothing. His heart simply gave up fighting the impossible. But Alvarenga wasn't ready to be the only human being in a radius of thousands of miles. This is the part many find hard to believe. For 6 days, Alvarenga kept Sardoba's body on the boat. He talked to the corpse. He asked questions about the fishing. He told him to be careful with the sun. He created a macabre theater to avoid facing the truth, that he was now the last man on Earth. When he finally regained lucidity and pushed his friend into the deep waters, solitude fell on him like a hammer. He became the most isolated man in history. To keep from going insane, Alvarenga created an obsessive routine. He walked 4 steps from one end of the boat to the other. 4 steps forward, 4 steps back. Thousands of times a day, he talked to the moon. He argued with the turtles. He sang hymns he didn't even know he knew. He was dancing on the razor's edge between survival and total dementia. In the middle of the Pacific, the greatest predator isn't a shark. It is the realization that the world has forgotten you exist. January 30th, 2014. 438 days. Alvarenga was lying on the floor of the boat, waiting for the end. He no longer hunted. He no longer prayed. But then, the sound changed. It was no longer the constant hitting of waves in the open ocean. It was the sound of something breaking. The sound of surf. He lifted his head and saw a green so intense it burned his retinas. It wasn't a hallucination. It wasn't a ghost ship. It was Ibn Atoll, in the Marshall Islands. He had crossed the entire Pacific Ocean in a fiberglass nutshell. He threw himself into the water. He swam with the last grams of energy his body still possessed. When he felt the sand under his fingers, he screamed. But no sound came out. He had forgotten how to use his vocal cords. 2 locals found him. They saw a naked man, with a beard that reached his chest, holding a rusty knife, with the eyes of someone who had seen the other side of existence. He had traveled over 10,000 kilometers. He had survived storms that sank cargo ships. He had survived hunger that kills in weeks. The world went into shock. Journalists, scientists, the curious. No one wanted to believe. But the sea currents confirmed the trajectory. The doctors confirmed the state of his organs. José Salvador Alvarenga proved that the human will is the most destructive and resilient force in nature. He returned home. But the sea never left him. He still looks at the rain as a miracle. And he still gives thanks every morning for the simple fact that there is ground beneath his feet. Thank you for joining us on this journey. If this story of resilience touched your spirit, subscribe and share. Because sometimes the only way out is to keep walking.